delighted to kick off things for the fall Geospatial Forum and introduce Dr. Eric Edwards today. Eric is a Geospatial Analytics Faculty Fellow and an assistant professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at NC State, where he runs North Carolina's extension program in water economics, improving our water quality and conservation through economic incentives and markets. His work's been funded by the USDA, NOAA, and NSF, and he holds a PhD in economics and environmental science from a place that is pretty special to me too, UC Santa Barbara. Yeah, so thanks, Eric. It's great having you here.
All right, great. Thanks everyone for coming. I think this is the second in-person talk I've given since COVID. So it's great to have everyone back and see everyone's faces and no masks. So I'm going to be talking about this paper about basically American Indian reservation water rights, and I'll get into the details of all that. The focus, I'm going to try to the extent possible to focus on some of the ways we've used sort of geospatial data, and more generally how economists, because we really are, we're not generators of data or data products, we're just users of them. So how we use the products, and especially how we use statistical analysis to and economic theory to do some of this stuff. I wanted to just point out at the beginning that the first author on this work is Leslie Sanchez, who's now doing a postdoc at the U.S. Forest Service. She was a PhD student at Tufts, and a lot of the heavy data work on this project was done by her. She was excellent. And then worked with Brian Leonard at Arizona State as well. So I'm going to start off with just a little motivation, although, sort of since I put the slide deck together a few months ago, this has all become such big news that it maybe doesn't need that much motivation. There's not enough water in the Colorado River right now, right? And there's always not been enough, right? Ever since it was first allocated. But now there's really not enough to the point where they're thinking of they're needing to cut back maybe 1 million or 2 million acre feet of water out of an average annual flow of about 12.4 million acre feet. So what this means is there's a lot of things that have sort of entered the phase of going from it's drought and their water is scarce to like, well, this is critical now, there's problems. And some of the problems are the water's getting so low that in Lake Powell that they're not going to be able to produce electricity in the dam anymore. Or, right, the water levels in Lake Mead, which is right by Las Vegas, are so low that that intake pipes are dry now. And luckily Las Vegas has put in a new lower intake pipe, but we're sort of at these sort of critical, I don't want to use threshold, but really is. We've really hit a point where we're sort of running out of water. How does this relate to tribal water rights? Well, tribal nations along the Colorado River own rights to a significant portion, 20 to 30% of that 12.4 million acre feet, right? And so if you talk about, and relatively little, when you read the popular press articles about this, they're talking about allocations between California and Arizona. But one of the things that has really been used to solve some of these shortages so far has been agreements with tribal governments that they lease back some of their water to the cities that are states that are running out of water. So tribal water rights really matter because they're going to be a really big deal in this area, right? Second motivation for the paper is more about the tribes themselves and how their access to property rights and rights to water, right? So beginning in the 1850s, water the water that was being used by the native populations started to be developed dammed, diverted to mostly agriculture, right? And this was done essentially without any regard for what the prior use were or what the people who were living there were doing with it, right? And we developed this prior appropriation doctrine, first in time, first in right. So whoever diverts the water, well, whatever white settler diverts the water first has the most senior right to it, right? And over time and by the early 1900s, most of the important basins in the Western US were completely diverted or completely allocated, right? To essentially to white farmers. And that meant that as they diverted water and in times of scarcity, reservations started to not have access to water, right? And by this time, tribes had been generally, well, by 1908, but from the 1850s onwards, tribes were being allocated lands in a series of wars and other sorts of pressures to be put on reservation lands, with the goal, in some sense, to develop agriculture and things like that. Well, there wasn't water on the reservations. There's this important Supreme Court case, Winters versus the US, where the Supreme Court ruled that even though there were no water rights at the time granted to tribes being put on reservations, that was an error. The federal government, when they made these treaty arrangements, had said you're going to do agriculture. The only way to do agriculture was to have water. And so therefore, there's an implicit right in every treaty for enough water to basically do agriculture to the extent that the reservation allows it, right? So we have a set of implicit water rights, not explicit, there's no water right yet, but a set of implicit water rights that the US government is responsible for providing to these reservations, right? And the priority date, right? First in time, first in right. The priority date is the reservation treaty date. And the reservation treaty dates are generally pretty early. So tribes have implicit water rights to a lot of water with very early priority dates. So they become implicitly the senior water rights holders in a lot of these regions, right? So what does that mean in reality? Well, today, only 56 of 170 reservations have converted this implicit right to water, right? This basically a right from a court ruling into a state water right to actually divert and use the water, right? About 3 million acre feet have been legally restored to tribes in the Western US. And there still remain what we estimate in an earlier paper about 1.5 to 2 million acre feet of water that tribes still have not only just claimed for, but that's the estimate of what they'll actually get in these settlement agreements. There's some controversy that the Navajo especially feel like they have a very large claim to water and they have not settled yet. So there's only 12.4 million acre feet. Something like 20% is already owned by tribal governments, and then another, maybe 1.6 million acre feet are potentially going to go to tribal governments. Well, what happens? Well, to do this, to reallocate this water right, it has to come from some other users, right? So the Colorado River Basin's all allocated, and now say, well, these tribal governments, the people living on reservations have this very senior water right. And so what happens are extended negotiations to basically, how do you reallocate the water and in a lot of cases, open up some funding to make these deals go through so that water remains flowing to places that it needs to while the tribes receive their water right entitlements. And so one of the key issues here, because the water needs to come from existing users, is that it's not clear what happens when the tribes make an agreement basically, and the federal government is a party in the agreement, but the agreement is really with the tribe, the state government who controls the water rights, and other users to reallocate the water rights. There's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen because there's not enough water to just, the tribes get their water and the other users get to keep using their water, right? So someone's going to have to give something up. And the tribes, even though they have these very senior water rights, are in a lot of ways in a pretty disadvantaged position for a variety of reasons that we'll get into. But, you know, there's less investment in things like irrigation infrastructure. There's a lot of land use restrictions on reservations, especially associated with tribal and allotted trust land that make it really difficult for tribes to develop their agriculture the way that other areas can. And this creates a couple problems. The first problem is, well, you can't develop your agricultural economy. The second problem is you have a paper water right, but if the existing users aren't convinced that you can divert it to do something with, they're very unlikely to let you take control of that water right, right? So without the threat of being able to actually divert the water, the tribes, even though they have a paper water right, may not have control over the wet water and therefore may not gain the benefits of the water. So, like I said, what I'm going to try to do, I'm going to walk you through some of the institutional details a little bit. But what I'm really focused on for this talk is how are we going to estimate what was the impact of these winter settlements on tribal water use, right? So we have 56 reservations that have settled, right? We want to understand what the impact was, right? And this is, I think, what, and you hear all the time about what economists do, but this is, I think, one of the really great things that economics can contribute is we think a lot about what is the way to actually estimate what the change has been, right? Not actually measure the change, right? We're going to just use someone else's product. And I think we spend way too little time even thinking about what it is we're using. But how do we think about what do we compare to? How do we do this estimation? And then if there's time, I'll get to some back of the envelope calculations where we go from, I had switched these, but I guess they got switched back. What is the impact of winter settlements on tribal land use? That's what we can estimate using the spatial data that we have, the remote sense data. And then we do some back of the envelope calculations to get that into, well, what was the tribal water use? And I'll probably end up, given the amount of time, I probably end up won't time those, but in the paper, we spend a lot of time talking about, well, what we're going to find, what we're going to find is that the tribes use a small fraction, many of the tribes use a small fraction of the water that they've actually gotten through the settlements. And this is over a period of decades, right? And so what we want to understand is, well, why? You get a water right, it's really should be very valuable, right? We're talking, 12.4 million acre feet. These water rights, general rule of thumb is, at least, $600 to $1,000 per acre foot per year is the value. So you're talking, the tribal water rights that the tribes aren't using, we estimate is a cost of about $1.6 billion per year, right? And this isn't a large group of people. I mean, they're large land area reservations, but it's a really big impactful change. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about what institutional constraints limit the ability of tribes to use the water. Let's see how many back. Yeah. So real quick background on the winter settlement. And I've sort of alluded to all this, right? There's a Supreme Court ruling that's federal, right? Water rights are all state. So water rights are allocated by state governments to users. State governments allocated their water rights to the white settlers to do farming, to divert water, to do irrigation. You fly over some parts of the country, you see the big center pivots that, this is how agriculture works in the Western US. And for that reason, there has to be a negotiation. The federal government is legally required to aid the tribes in these negotiations. Oftentimes, the tribes have to sue the federal government to get them to get involved, to aid them in these negotiations. And then you start negotiating. The federal government has a settlement team and they come in and they help out the tribes. It's very expensive, right? So we wrote a paper about this that's in Environmental Research Letters in 2020. It was basically like, what causes settlements to happen? Why did they take a long time? And so there's trends towards settlement. Basically, settlement increases as the benefits of settlement to the tribe increase. So if you have more land and the water is more valuable, you're more likely to settle. Settlements take a lot longer, especially with the number of bargaining parties and then the political makeup of Congress. These settlements have to be funded, and Democratic Congresses fund settlements and Republican Congresses don't fund settlements. So generally they wait. So there's just a big one, the Flathead Reservation in Montana, right? They made the agreement a number of years ago, and then once the new Democratic Congress just came in, then they get the agreement settled and funded, and they move forward from that. So initially there were some court decrees. You might notice on a map, if you know anything about reservations, when I show it, that there's some reservations that are missing. There were some early reservations, those along Colorado, that had court decrees. After that, it's all been basically settlements. The court, if you go to state court to try to get your water rights, you don't get the sort of outcome that the tribes feel like they're entitled to. You get better outcomes with negotiation. So why are we interested in water rights and reservations? Well, these reservations tend to be the most poorly developed places in the United States, right? The Navajo, I'm not sure if that statistics on there. There are water problems. There's a substantial portion of Navajo, for instance, don't have access to running water. The levels of per capita income are like a third of the U.S. average. So these are some of the poorest areas. And so, what's driving this? There's a lot of literature that suggests it's access to resources and the ability to use resources. And a lot of that comes down to things like access to banking, access to your own land, and whether you can do the sorts of development. This is a paper we wrote on irrigation investment, which basically says on reservation land, it's really hard to get access to capital to put in things like a center pivot irrigation system. And I was part of a project where we worked with a lot of tribes in the Southwest. And this is not just about land tenure and the different regulations. It's also about discrimination. There's a ruling, the Vilsack ruling, where the USDA was actively discriminating against tribal farmers. So whether it's the USDA loaning you money or not having land to use as collateral, it's hard to get access, and this is going to affect the ability to use water later. So here's where I switched. So, tribal. What is the impact of winter settlements on tribal land? Right. So here's where I'm going to get into the methods, and this is where I'm going to spend the bulk of the rest of it, and then I'll show you some results briefly at the end. I think I have like 40 minutes. Is that about? And then questions after that? All right, perfect. And this is where. I left this slide up here because this is a slide for econ audiences. But this is where you're going to see the difference, like an economist as a user of this data. This is what we would show to an econ audience, right? We've got land use data, we've got land tenure data, and we've got land quality data. We're going to put it in a regression. And that's generally all they want to see. right? We might show a little map like I'm going to show you on in a couple of pages, but that's basically it, right? I'll come back and talk about that a little bit in detail, but this is all from this Dipple, Fry, and Leonard paper about land use on reservations and in particular land tenure. This is really cool data. I'll come back to that. No one else has like really gotten this sort of data before. And then we use our previous papers and Leslie's work, Leslie Sanchez's work on adjudication start and end dates. So she went through every single court filing for all these reservations, read through them all, got a bunch of data out of them, including when the negotiations started, when they were settled, and then a bunch of other reservation and settlement covariance. So things like off-reservation population, banking access, where they have casinos. Some of this is publicly available in other data sets, but a lot of it wasn't, especially the data about the settlements themselves, right? All the settlements are just big legal documents. There's a big database somewhere with all these documents, but she went through those to find all that, right? And so let me see, I'm going to jump ahead just to show you kind of what that data looked like that she put together. So these are the reservation, all the reservations in the Western US that have at least started the process of trying to settle their tribal water rights. Starting with the Walker River Reservation, that's sort of south of Reno, which started in the late 1920s. That one, by the way, is still ongoing. They have not settled their water rights. So that's the longest ongoing one. And then the end of the bars are when they settled, and then you can see we've sort of color coded them. So the blue is they haven't been treated with settlement yet because they're still ongoing. Some have recently started ongoing, right? But some have been around for a while. And then you see like the settlements, some are settled kind of all together. I'm not sure. Yeah, like these two are settled together at the same time. But generally so this is the data that we were able to put together for all these tribes. That date of settlement is going to be kind of our treatment. That's going to be what we want to know what happens. So here's the negotiations. We want to know what happens after that in terms of tribal water use. All right, so the land data, right? So we sort of thought of land on reservations as a grid of basically 40-acre parcels. Why 40 acres? A few reasons, but generally when the land was allotted to tribes, that was the smallest unit that would go out. And I don't have time to get into the details. If you want to get upset about something, Google online Dawes Act, and you'll learn about how, even given the reservation land that was allocated to tribes, what happened because of the Dawes Act in terms of trying to allocate some of that land to individual tribal members and then declaring the rest as surplus. So from the time the reservations were created to after the Dawes Act, I think about 2/3 of the land was declared surplus and reallocated back to white settlers, right? So, but in terms of data, right? Kids, I think, got 40-acre parcels. Adults got 80 or 160-acre parcels on some reservations. Other reservations, the one I've studied really closely, which is the Uinta Ure Reservation in Utah. There was really strong resistance among the members trying to prevent this sort of allotment. And so they never really allotted. So all their land is still held by the tribal government. But anyway, so we have these 40-acre blocks. And what we're going to observe is land use based on this NWALT satellite data. And you guys might be familiar with this contemporaneous anthropogenic land use, wall-to-wall land use trends, which doesn't spell NWALT in any way. So I'm not sure what NWALT stands for. But we're basically going to take that data and we're going to get an observation for land use from 1974 to 2012. We were really excited when we found this data set. We didn't know that this existed because it goes back early enough for us to observe all these settlements, right? And that was really the key, and that's really the only reason we chose this particular data set. It's the one that goes back far enough. It's amazing to have land use data back to 1974. There's not really any other data on anything else on what goes on reservations, right? There's per capita income for the reservation as a whole. There's some other really coarse measures for a variety of reasons, both kind of top down and choices that tribes make. They don't like to have a lot of people taking data and being involved on their lands for obvious reasons. So there's sort of like data deserts, reservations. And so we can do a lot with this data, which is great. And then again, standard econ thing, we're going to throw in a bunch of controls for land quality. And so, and in the interest of time, I will just kind of start to show you how we use that. And then maybe if you guys are interested or you have complaints, we can talk about that later. So here's essentially what we're going to do, right? We get the NWALT data for what we define as developed, which is going to be roads, houses, parking lots, buildings, anything like that, and any other infrastructure. And then agriculture, which we're going to do crops plus hay and pasture for our main specifications, but we can break it out by just crops, just hay and pasture, things like that. And then we can look at either the percentage of a 40-acre parcel that's in some type of land use. That's going to be our kind of our primary specification. But we could also look at the probability that it has any sort of agricultural use, and that you can get at sort of, problems with measurement, or, does it, and it really doesn't make that much difference, right? For what we want to do, we want to know, like, after we have agriculture, we assume most of the agriculture has to be irrigated, or a lot of it's irrigated. We have agriculture, we have a settlement, how does this map change from before the settlement to after the settlement? And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at this as our unit of observation, and we're going to try to estimate that. So here are reservations. One of the things that we're interested in, right, is we are going to do what we call, and you guys, some of you may be familiar with, a difference in difference estimation approach. So we want to observe, the blue reservations before and after settlement. And then we want to observe the orange reservations all along and see, do the blue reservations have some jump up in water use, or in this case, agricultural land use primarily, after the settlement. So we want to make sure that these orange reservations are a good counterfactual for the blue reservations. And, that's going to be an important part of this. One thing that we do, though, is the counterfactual reservations aren't the entire world of reservations. So there's, I think I said like 150 that haven't settled at all, or haven't even begun or there's about 120 that haven't even begun the process at all. Those are going to be fundamentally different from those that have begun the process and settled, or those have begun the process for the reasons I talked about, right? There's benefits to settling and costs, and the ones that haven't even started don't look that different, or look very different from the ones that have started. Why do we think we can use the ongoing with the settled? Well, that has to do with these delays, right? So we want to basically randomly treat certain reservations with a settlement and see what happens to their land use afterwards, right? And what you notice is the date you start negotiating, right, which is going to be based on, it's your economic decision, right, as a reservation to say, all right, I want to try to sell these water rights because it's going to be beneficial to the tribe or the reservation, and there's a variety of things that go into that. That doesn't really have much correlation to when you're going to finish, right? Walker River, first one to start, they're still going. Why? Because the irrigation district in Nevada they're negotiating with basically won't settle with them, and they've kind of been intractable for generations at this point. Other ones can settle really fast, right? And so that's what we're gonna, the settlement date relative to the blues, right? You see some that start at the same time. And then these green ones ended here, the orange one ended here, the blue one ends here. So the end date, that treatment, when they're actually settled, we take as plausibly kind of random. And we can test that a little bit with like parallel trends and things like that. So I mentioned the difference in difference estimator, right? So we're going to look before, after, treated, untreated. And so what you have to do this, right? So what you'd like to do is you'd like to be in a world where you have a reservation that gets treated at a certain time. And you'd like to take that same reservation and not treat it. And then observe how the treated and untreated ones do. But of course, you only have one reservation that's treated. That's why we use the untreated reservations. And so that's what this sort of equation is saying is what you want, treated in the second, in the treatment period relative to the treated in the pre-treatment period. And then you subtract from that how the untreated one has changed from the pre-treatment to the post-treatment period. This assumption that this, right, is a good representation of what the treated reservation, how its change would have been, right? So the assumption that the untreated reservation is a good proxy for the treated reservation, or would have done the same thing, the treated reservation would have done the same thing, but for it got treated, is what we call the parallel trends assumption, right? So that's typically our big assumption. And we're economists, right? So we're going to use a regression to do this estimation. Now, I'm not going to get into the details here, but this regression is because of the setup of our problem, where we have a staggered rollout of treatment over a number of years. What we call just running a standard regression, where we have controls for the reservation, control for the year, some other set of controls. That's all the things I said we'll dump in their elevation and things like that. And then we have a dummy for post-settlement, right? This is what we call the two-way fixed effect estimator. And this has become a very important topic in economics. This is not a good estimator of the average treatment effect. Because of the nature of that. It would be if all the changes had occurred in the same year, but if it occurs over time, you end up running the regression, right? And when you run a regression, you just throw stuff into a statistical package and it's going to do what it's going to do. Well, what it does is it starts comparing all the different potential comparison groups. So what you end up doing is you end up comparing, say, this group that adjudicated or settled between 2002 and 2012 with the outcomes of the group that had settled, a couple decades before. And that's not really what you want to be doing. And so we use robust estimators in the paper. If you have questions about this, I'm happy to talk a lot about this and direct you to research. So if you're doing anything like this, reach out. I'll send you. We actually just had a speaker today in our colloquium who talked all just about this, basically just about this equation and how to fix it. And I've recorded that. So if you're doing anything that looks like this and you're using a regression, talk to me about it. Okay, so the other big thing economists are interested in, and then I'll show you some results and we'll quit, is what we call identification, right? And identification that's going to be kind of what assumptions we have to make so that we can conclude that the thing that the treatment is what is actually causing the outcome. And there's not something else that's causing the outcome, right? So you can imagine you have a reservation that gets treated with a settlement, and at the same time, something else happens nearby. There's a big economic boom. a bunch of population moves in. The reservation, because all this population moves in, the reservation opens a casino. The reservation has a bunch of development that's completely unrelated to the water settlement. We want to eliminate that. We want to understand what's the change because of the settlement. So the two assumptions, I mentioned that the first is the exogeneity of treatment, and I've already discussed that, right? That has to do with, is this treatment date like as good as random, or is it in some way going to be correlated with the outcome that we're observing, right? So one thing that we might worry about is if you settled earlier because, right, you're more likely to invest more in agricultural land or something, something it really has to do with agriculture, have to do with agriculture. But in any case, that's the first, and then the second is the parallel trends. That means our untreated group and treated group, but for the treatment, would have continued to have basically the same difference between them over time. The parallel trends assumption, we can look at the pre-trends, the sort of the difference in the group's pre-trend to see what happens. Exogeneity of treatment, right? We can sort of discuss, and we can discuss a lot of the aspects of this. But some of these things you have to just say, okay, it seems plausible. You've explained why you think it's exogenous. To the extent you believe it is the extent that you believe that the estimate is causal, right? That settlements are causing this change in water. So our biggest concern, as I mentioned, is some sort of omitted variable bias, right? There's some variable that's affecting agricultural use on the reservation and the timing of settlement, right? So timing of settlement is driven particularly by the US Congress and off-reservation population growth. Those are our potentially biggest omitted variable bias. We do things like add a state by year fixed effect. That is going to be some trend in the data that's going to, for a state. So if like New Mexico is growing faster than Nevada, and the treated reservations in New Mexico and the untreated reservations in Nevada, you're going to control for that growth so that that's not what's causing your outcome. All right, so let me show you the results and then I'll take questions. So this is what we call an event study. This is for the percentage of the reservation that's in agriculture, and the first period. This is the first period before settlement. This is the first period after settlement, right? And so this is what we call the pre-trends, and each of these coefficients is basically the difference, controlling for all the stuff I've talked about. We're controlling for the difference between the untreated and the treated reservation. 3 periods, 2 periods, and 1 period prior to it being treated, right? So our parallel trend assumption is that these two reservations would have been identical, or this would be 0, but for the treatment that occurs here. So this shouldn't show much trend, and this generally doesn't show much trend. These are not that different from 0 and are small. And then after treatment, what we'd expect is if agricultural land use increases, you get positive, statistically significant differences between the untreated and the treated. And what we see is, and this is what we call the dynamics of the treatment, post-treatment, how does that treatment effect change? What you see is kind of what you might expect, right? The first decade after treatment, there's a small effect, the second decade, and by the third decade, the effect is fairly large, just over 1% by the third. So let me sum up the results. Oh, wait, let me show you what a development looks like, right? So you might say, okay, well, you showed those results, you said those were significant. It looks like agriculture increases after treatment. What about, what does it look like if you don't get a result? Well, development, we don't get a result, right? You have some pre-treatment, there's not trends, and post-treatment, there's not much going on, right? These are all, the point estimates, their confidence intervals all include 0. So they're not statistically different from 0. And so we say there's not much trend in development, right? And so for the last slide here, I will just tell you what the results mean. So what we see is on average, and on average is basically some average of these 3 point estimates, right? On average is a 0.614 percentage point change in agriculture. Given that agriculture on reservation is about 7% of land use, this represents about almost a 9% increase in the agricultural land use per parcel. And so what does that mean? Well, if you look at a per parcel level, it's about 0.8 acres per parcel, right? But they're not the average, it's not the average parcel that's getting agriculture, right? So what does it mean for the average reservation, which has about 6,200 parcels? Well, it means about 5,000 acres of new agriculture per reservation. So we find a statistically significant effect on agricultural land use after, but the effect is really small. And so I'm just gone long, but the last 2 minutes here, I'll show you this. We do a quick calculation where we assume each acre uses anywhere from 2 to 5 acre feet of water per acre. So 5 is kind of on the high end of what you need for irrigated agriculture in the West. 2 is kind of on the low end, and that's for each reservation. So the low bar is 2 acre feet, high bar is 5 acre feet. This is how much water use changed as a percentage of the total water right entitlement that the tribe received, right, post-settlement. So, some of the reservations, the settlement led to very large increases in the amount of water used, but most they were fairly low. And if you go, and this is just the change. And so one thing you might say is, well, this is the change is low, right? But it might be that these are legal property rights, but they may have already been using some of the water. So let's look at total water use in 2012 by category, right? So blue is agricultural water, and we go from 0% of their water right entitlement. This is what they have legal right to 100%. Blue is agriculture, red is developed. Yellow is water that the tribe has subsequently leased to someone else, right? In particular, probably a city in Arizona or something like that. And then the gray is what we estimate as unused water. And so after this table, which generally shows that, but for a few reservations, so like Uinta and Fallon, a lot of the reservations aren't even the reservations. These are all reservations that have settled, right? A lot of the reservations, even after settlement, aren't using a very high percentage of their of the water right entitlement that they have. And this includes some reservations have the right, even if they don't use it themselves, to lease off reservation and make money off of it. A lot don't, may not have the right, or may not have a market to do that. And so you see a lot of reservations with what we would call probably paper water rights that are in uncompensated use by someone else. So the tribe owns the water on paper, someone else is using the water, and the tribe is not getting paid. The only tribes that are getting paid for other people using their water are the ones who have these lease agreements, the yellow. And so then we spend the rest of the paper trying to break down and explain why there's not as much, why there isn't that much water use, why these settlements don't lead to a lot of increases in water use. The results aren't inconsistent with kind of general outcomes of sort of restoring property rights to groups when or indigenous groups when there's all these other inequities or constraints that in some cases this works, and certainly the tribes these tribes have a lot of income from leasing. Fort Hall, I know the water manager there, and she says that they fund their entire water resource department plus other programs just from that water, that yellow water that they lease. That's in kind of in southeast Idaho. So, but in general, there's, trying to explain this is like the rest of the paper. But I'll stop there and I take questions for a few minutes, and then yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Eric. We'll start with questions from the in-person audience, and if we have a natural pause, Eric is going to, Eric Money. Or John is going to take questions from our online audience, which there's quite a number. Right. Aaron, if anyone would like the mic, I can run it to you.
Thank you. Very interesting. So I'm a bit confused about why only some reservations under the settlement process can sell water that they own. And it seems like others have to invest in some sort of infrastructure to capture the water, maybe before they can sell it. So that's one question. The other question that leads to is whether there may be tribes that in fact are investing in agriculture in order to settle, right? They've got to be able to capture the water in order to settle to maybe later sell. So you might have sort of the opposite direction of causality.
Yeah. So two good questions. So the first one, Leslie has actually written a piece about the tribal water marketing. It's really complicated. Certain tribes made sure in their agreements to negotiate the right to lease. Others were more constrained. It's a negotiation. So who and when they can lease is oftentimes determined by the other water users in the negotiation. And so, yeah, I mean, as a fellow economist, you can see the sort of inefficiency and potential problems that not allowing the tribes to lease creates. And that sort of leads to your second question, which is there preemptive development of agriculture? I think that's less of a concern, but because the way the winters is set up is you can get your amount you can claim has to do with practically irrigable acreage, not the amount of agriculture you actually have in production. But your intuition is absolutely right. So some reservations at some point in time received money from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to build, and sometimes in conjunction with, but often independent of Bureau of Reclamation, to build reclamation projects. So all the big dams and things you see in the West, there's some of those on reservations. Those tribes that already had that infrastructure in place, when they settled, right, they're the ones compared to the other tribes. They're the only ones who saw increases in agriculture. So what we can say is the effect of settlement on agricultural land use increase, that effect that I estimated, I showed you that nice graph. That's entirely coming from reservations that already had Bureau of Indian Affairs reclamation projects on their reservation, and no one else saw any increase in agriculture. So yeah, the being able to use the water makes a big difference on whether you actually use the water after.
The other fellow economist in the room. Mark.
So why do you think that development didn't increase significantly after the treatment was applied?
Yeah, that's another good question. Even more so than agriculture, development has a lot of constraints on reservations, and may initially not have been as constrained by a lack of water, right? So a reservation, if they had the need to develop either more housing or more roads, more industry, they could do that kind of independent of water. What we had sort of suspected might happen was if you got a bunch of water, your comparative advantage, that's a big increase in your sort of your endowment of resources. Your comparative advantage as a reservation might not be in agriculture, but that big inflow of capital might allow you to invest in certain things. And one of the big things that a lot of tribal governments talk about is on reservation housing for the members of their tribe. So although we have reservations, and although a lot of tribal members live on reservations, a lot don't. A lot live in housing in cities. Sometimes that housing in cities is subsidized or paid for by the reservation, but there's this idea that, well, at some point we'd like to reinvest this money and move our people back onto a reservation. We don't see any evidence of that. And part of that could be that although you have the rights, you're not really getting that capital inflow that you'd expect. But yeah, I mean, it's a good question.
Well, one other question. So when a tribe receives property rights to the water, what happens to the people who lose those rights? Because presumably some people would lose them since it's a finite resource.
Yeah, so someone gives up the water, and so someone either gets a less secure water property right, which means they would, in drier years, they might get less, or they have to give up some of their rights entirely. Wesley has the third chapter of her dissertation was about that, and basically how the negotiations work, and basically the irrigation districts, the non-tribal irrigators who have less secure water rights, tend to give up more water in the negotiations, but people tend to not give up seniority, right? So the more senior irrigation districts keep their water, and the more junior diverters lose water. But yeah, there's certainly to the extent that tribes get new water, someone's giving them up, and certainly in the negotiations. And I actually think to a larger point, if you can imagine a world where suddenly the tribes just started diverting all this water, there would be a lot more impact on non-tribal agriculture than there has been so far, because so little of the water, at least right now, is being diverted onto the reservation.
Thanks, Eric. I am not an economist, but I was wondering, with the Supreme Court being what it is, and so many pending agreements, is there concern that, this initial finding was based on this implicit understanding of right? Is there a concern that
Yeah.
these could be overturned, or have there been other protections codified since then?
So there's the Supreme Court in Indian country is always very complicated. There was a recent ruling, the McGirt ruling in Oklahoma, and that basically was sort of went against what you might expect, which gave a lot more autonomy over land to the tribal government. But there's been a recent ruling that sort of I think a child welfare or murder case, I don't remember, that took away a lot. So the concern is really how much autonomy the tribes are given over their resource, and usually the resource that they're talking about is land, but water is usually in that. I don't think there's any concern over winters being overruled, but certainly, the baseline is that tribal land and reservations are held in trust by the federal government for the tribes, which means that fundamentally they're always under the control of the federal government, what the federal government wants to do. And so there's always these Supreme Court things that can give and take away, sort of control over the rights. But I think it's a big concern. There is one, now I forget who it is, but there is one very conservative person on the Supreme Court who's very pro tribal. What's that? Yeah. So there is, the latest ruling he sided with all the liberal justices, and so that's tribal politics is always complicated because generally there's, it follows along the lines you might think in a lot of ways, but in some ways it doesn't. And so there's always that sort of, there's the sort of property rights, these are set contracts from 150 years ago, and those need to be enforced like by their letter. And so there's always that sort of like legal thinking that can kind of pervade some of these cases.
Okay, I think we have time for one more quick question, which I'd like to give the online audience a chance. John, you have one of your favorites you could? There are none. Okay. Well, given that there's only 1 minute left, let's respect everybody's time and give Eric a big thank you. Thanks, Eric. And thank you, everyone. Oh, quick announcement, just so everybody knows, we got a number of you.